Hi, everybody. Good evening from Ottawa. Today is the live stream I'm really excited to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about photo colorization, and something I've never really done too much with or talked about too much is private photos of soldiers. So today I'm joined by Sarah Hart. She's really knowledgeable about this stuff. I've learned tons of stuff, things I don't even had thought about previously through her stuff on social media. Follow her on Twitter. I can put all that stuff down in the link below, but she's pretty easy to find. So please do follow her. So we're just going to get started now. Hey, Sarah, how's it going?
Good, hey. How are you?
I'm good. It's got a little cooler here in Ottawa, but it's okay after it's been so hot lately. I'm sure, well, you're in Ottawa too, so you're getting the same thing. So. Yeah, so that's cool. So I was just wondering if we could kind of start off this evening, kind of talking about how you got into this topic, particularly like the colorization. I mean, it's a bit of a controversial topic, particularly nowadays. I mean, it's getting more and more attention, I think, daily on social media and within the historical field itself. So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about how you got into that, or even, and then if you can move to talking about like the private photos or will those two come together, that would be great.
Yeah. So I did my master's research on private photos and official photographs, and how those photos, like what those photos tell us about the experience of the First World War, both during the war and immediately following. So right up until about 1920. And this was at the same time that Peter Jackson's film, They Shall Not Grow Old, was coming out. And so whenever I said, I study First World War photos, everyone was like, oh, what are your thoughts about Peter Jackson's film? Have you seen it yet? And part of me was like, oh God, please stop. I don't want to answer this.
Yeah.
The other part of it was like, let me do my thing. Let me finish this master's and then I'll write a book on it. And that book has turned into my PhD.
Yeah, that happens.
So the joke became like an actual thing.
Yeah, like that's that happens sometimes. I mean, these topics get asked so much, or you explore an avenue you haven't thought of, or a different way of thinking about it. But anyway, yeah. So like again, we were just kind of talking about this before we started, but like this is not. We're both PhD candidates doing our thing. I mean, I'm a little further along than you, but like we said, this is more of a more relaxed kind of way taking questions. So I'm going to ask you, unfortunately, I know you're probably tired of hearing it, but I'm going to ask you about that film because I think it is important. I mean, and just a little anecdote here, but I first, Carla Jean just signed on. Good evening. What time is it for her? Good afternoon, Carla. Good afternoon for her out on the West Coast there. So as I was saying, yeah, anecdote. Sorry, I was in Britain doing my research, second round of research or something like that for this during when that was released on the BBC. And like I do some stuff with the First World War, not a lot. Like my focus has been Second World War, so that kind of different. But anyway, so I remember just hearing about it just through somewhere somebody was talking about it, and watched it live, and I was like mesmerized for however long it is. I don't even remember. I don't think I moved. Like, and I was staying in this tiny little place. I didn't have like a couch. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, and I don't think I moved the entire time. Like I was just so awestruck about that, and I had known about the issues of colorization and all that stuff. So I mean, I'm not a lay person, obviously, but that's not my focus. So I was just kind of hoping to think like, what were your kind of initial reactions to it? If I assume you've seen it by now. I mean, it's on Canadian Netflix and everything. I've watched it since. So I was just wondering like kind of what your initial reaction to it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think like removing myself from it and like trying to understand it, like how my dad understands it, how like my military friends understand it. It does some really cool things about like talking about the experiences of war. The integration of the oral histories is brilliant. The creation of the Foley sounds is really cool. And I don't know if you know this, but there's a First World War aircraft at the Ingenium Air and Space Museum here in Ottawa that actually was restored as part of this project with Peter Jackson. Like it was sent down to New Zealand, fully restored. And it's a Canadian artifact.
Wow, that's a bit of a hike.
Yeah. So like, that's cool because it gets museums involved in a really interesting way. the lip reading, I think, is a brilliant tool that I'd like to see that applied in other places.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think it's a great tool.
Yeah, but I have issues with it.
Okay.
I have issues because the narrative is very British.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very male. The women that are mentioned in there are, and I've said this before in other forums, the women that are there are used as sex workers. That's not a bad thing. There's no problem with that, but that's not the only female experience of the war.
Right.
They worked in munitions factories. They were nurses. They stepped in on the home front. They took care of children. And the civilian side in France and Belgium, they're the ones who are propping up these economies that soldiers are actually partaking in. So I have a suspicion that some of the cameras and the photos that were developed were probably done in France and Belgium from the private photos, right? So they're making these industries happen behind the scenes that doesn't get talked about in that film.
Right.
There's also no discussion of colonial troops. Canada, not mentioned.
Right.
I think New Zealand gets a passing mention in the end credit because Peter Jackson's great-grandfather was a New Zealand flyer. It's something very far removed, right? And very personal. There's no mention of India. There's no mention of the Americans. So it's a very one-dimensional piece. And I don't know if that's because it's the Imperial War Museum archive that he's working from and the limit of their materials, or if it's not necessarily willful ignorance, but a purposeful decision to keep it very British.
Right. Yeah. I mean, personally, I don't know. I don't know if he's talked about much of that side of the production of it. I mean, I've seen a few interviews with him. Doesn't talk about that per se. He just kind of talks about, I had a family connection. So it's kind of, because I remember, because again, part of that whole just sitting there, I watched the whole credits. Because it's a rather inappropriate song, speaking of sex workers, but playing at the credits at the end. So I just kind of stuck through the whole thing. And I think I counted one Canadian as part of the oral history project there. There's one Canadian credited. I mean, there's a few New Zealanders, and might be a few Aussies, no Indians. I don't think maybe there was one American, or one of them could have been American in another service. I don't know. But I think to me, that was an issue. Obviously, we're going to be have an issue with Canada not getting a representation, but also this wider war that is undocumented, which is a problem. I mean, it happens, and it's not just Peter Jackson doing it. All kinds of people do it, and particularly with the colorization of photos. I think you see that the most. You see stuff from the front line. I mean, there's a little bit from behind the lines or the factories or what have you, but I just don't think, I don't know what it is. I don't know if people just don't find that interesting enough, if it's not worth their time. I don't know. I mean, maybe you could shed some light onto that if you've done some looking into why people do the colorization or what they focus on or why.
I mean, I think from what I can tell, and again, I haven't talked to any of the colorizers, and from what I can tell, again, based off of social media, specifically the Vimy Foundation, it's photographs that they think are appealing, that are widely circulated, and that they think will make a good story, because they're using them as social media leverage, right? So it's a story that they want to prop up and emphasize parts.
Right, so it's kind of an overall meta-narrative that they already have, and it just kind of fits.
Yeah.
I mean, and I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if you have a story to tell, I mean, it's not easy. I do the social media stuff myself, as I'm sure, people watching know, but it's not a bad thing. It's just sometimes things get lost, things get left out, and sometimes it's not on purpose. I mean, it's hard to tell these stories. But again, like you said, what gets focused on, what doesn't, can be problematic. And I think you might agree with me. That's something we should keep in the back of our minds.
Yeah.
Of what's being focused on, what's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's the film itself. So the film as an object.
Right.
And I don't think people know this, but the film that Jackson works off of is a copy of the original at best. I
did not know that.
Yeah. So film pre-1920, movie film pre-1920 is, it can self-combust for no reason other than it just wants to set itself on fire.
Yeah, is that enough? It says I'm out.
Yeah, done here. Thank you. Bye. So in order to preserve the film, you have to make a copy of it on what's called safety film, which is a completely different, it's a different aspect ratio. It can cut off. It's a copy, so we don't know. Like there are so many factors to the preservation of that can be an issue. And then it's a copy of a copy, because film technology has been updated. The gelatin that the film is made out of gets better. Resolution improves, however you want to describe improval.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we can maybe talk about that later, but I think that's a really interesting concept of what approved, like better, what that means. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit too, well, you and me, and even with me and Carla have discussed this as well, like what's actually better, like there's this, myth, I guess, probably the best way to say, like the quality is going to be terrible no matter what because of these old cameras. And I think Carla's done a good job of proving that's just not true. I mean, I've seen some stuff, I've seen you show some stuff, and I'm just like, this is amazing. And it runs, I think it gives today's technology a run for its money, and it's better in a lot of cases. But anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a digression. But
I think the clarity of a film is better than a digital version because you're consolidating things into tiny squares, right? So each pixel is a tiny square, and you have to fit into the square. Whereas with film, it's shades. There's no constraints like that. So the clarity is, I think, better. And Jackson in the film also, he makes up pieces because the film's jerky, right? He talks about slowing it down or speeding it up based on the frames per second. So the pieces in between, they've made up those pieces to fill in. So I think you have to get into a question of how are we ascribing authenticity to the film? And I think that the way that authenticity has been described to They Shall Not Grow Old is actually through the things that I think it does really well, which is the interviews that it repurposes, the sounds that get added, right?
Yeah.
The things that we think make it authentic are actually the things that are the most fabricated.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, like, again, I don't want to go too down my road because we can go down that rabbit hole for hours and hours and hours of like what authentic even means. And I mean, you've talked about that. It's been talked about, like your panel at the Laurier colloquium there. That was talked about that. I mean, Matt talked about that and his work. And I mean, my head kind of get a little confused. And I've talked to you, I've talked to Matt tons, and I'm still like, what do you got? What? And I mean, confused in a good way. Like, I was just like, okay, sure. That's another thing I just assumed I knew a little bit about. Let's blow it out of the water. But anyway, so like, again, the authenticity, like, I mean, my issues with that, I don't have that many issues with the film. I mean, if you take it for what it is, I think it's amazing. I mean, it's told in a, a loose linear format. I mean, it starts off with this, kind of immersion style, like moving up to the front line kind of thing and getting into the communication trenches, all that kind of stuff. And then they do that change, right? They change it to the color, they change the frame rates and everything. I just think that's it's a great thing. It's a great sensory experience for people. I mean, it's going to not even be close to the real thing, but if it gets people interested, I mean, I'm always in favor of that. So, but again, it's another thing I think we have to keep, with a grain of salt. It's not meant to be like, a well-researched, narrative that's going to be, published by university press or anything like that. But I mean, it's a teachable moment too. And I think that's great. So I want to move on because you sent me some really cool stuff. So I want to start looking at that. Yeah. So just give me a second here. I'm going to pull that up. Yeah, so you sent me a bunch of photos. We'll go through them, but I like this one is the first one you sent. I think it's kind of cool. I was kind of confused at first. I forgot the word of what it was called. So I was just wondering if you could talk about kind of generally what we're looking at here and kind of some background behind it.
Yeah, so this is, let me just double check that I have his name right before I speak off topic. So this is Sgt Sidney Percival Cox's album, and this is at the Canadian War Museum here in Ottawa, and it's a scrapbook, but the scrapbook itself is it's a mix of things like this, where it's
Okay.
These like mass-produced, hand-tinted sort of postcards, but not, because they're massive.
Yeah, they're huge.
Yeah.
I just noticed that. I mean, I obviously I noticed that before, but now I'm looking, I'm going, yeah, that's not going in the mail.
Yeah, it's about 6 inches
Wow.
long, give or take.
Yeah, that's intense.
Right, and like they're mass produced. They're part of this like travel thing, and this is this is 1 page of maybe 8 in that bigger album. He also includes photographs that are like some official photographs. And when I say official, I mean American photojournalists took the photos. They're not Canadian, they're American made from the early part of the war. So 1914.
Which would make sense.
Yeah. There's also like, he has currencies like stuck into the scrapbook from all different countries. Like it's like a really weird, eclectic mix of stuff, but you can tell that these are all important. But the fact that he includes these like mass-produced hand tint images, I think speaks to that experience. And I mean, this is Versailles, and at the bottom, and I think the top is the Louvre. I could be completely misspeaking.
I think it is. Yeah, I think you're right. Hold on.
It just says Galerie de Bataille.
Yeah, I mean, well, the Louvre is massive.
So.
I mean, it looks like the Louvre to me. I mean, but yeah, anyway, yeah. So like, I was wondering, and yeah, I can focus on this one here too. Yeah, that's definitely the Hall of Mirrors. But if you could, briefly talk about how this is done. Like, is it? I mean, I know nothing. Like, is it done by hand? Like, is it literally taking a marker and going like coloring it in? Like, what's being done here?
So it's mass produced. So it's I think it's more like letterpress. When I say that, like I'm guessing because this is stuff
your
that
best guess.
Figuring out.
No one's going to hold you to it, but I mean, just if you have more than us, like more than.
So someone probably took a sketch off of a photograph and like put in all the pencil work details that was then put through a machine, and then you pick out the pieces that you want to be colored, and you put that onto a machine, and you roll the paper through.
Right.
So it's for every color, it's a different roller. And that's how that would get done. And so that way you can just like throw it through the presses, sort of the way that like a newspaper would be printed. Right.
Yeah, which makes sense because given the technology available and the ease of printing newspapers, I mean, particularly back then, I mean, the scope of newspapers back then gets a lot more attention now. But anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a digression. Anyway, so the next photo, I want to talk about this one because I used it as part of like the promotional. I just think it's really cool. I mean, the guy looks quite sad. But anyway, like it's like an autochrome. I wonder if you could kind of discuss what that means really quick.
Yeah, so let me, because I know Carla's watching, she's gonna have my butt if I don't properly describe.
No, she keeps us all honest. That's good and bad. I mean, I can't get away with the ignorance angle anymore.
Yeah, so it's an additive color process. So you would print the thing, and then color would get added to it. Yeah, that's what I got.
That's it. Okay. Yes.
That's what I got.
So it's done, like, I guess, using a layman term, like it's a post-production edition.
Yeah. So the color is added afterwards. It's not added at the time of the photograph.
Right. So it's not like because I've seen some, I mean, I don't know again about the authenticity, but like I know color photographs existed. I just know they're extremely difficult to do.
Yeah.
Inexpensive. I mean, particularly given wartime and all that kind of stuff. So maybe this kind of leads to a question I kind of have then. We're talking briefly about the authenticity and what that even means. But like, okay, so we've kind of established whatever the process is. I'm not going to guess because then Carla will yell at me. Is like it's done after, right? It's not done at the time. It's not done by, I don't think it'd be done by the photographer. It might be, I don't know. But is there a difference between this, which looks to be of the period, it says 1917, and what Peter Jackson was doing? Is it different in your opinion? Didn't mean to stump you, but I mean, if
No,
I
it's
figure you got to have something
no,
about
it's
this. Yeah.
it's like, how far into the semantics do I want to dive into? Because on the
Yeah.
surface, no, they're the same.
Right.
They're adding color after the fact, right?
Mhm.
It's just that like the color additive process is different because with this castle now photo, the color is more accurate because it's of the time, and you can tell that that the color in it is more accurate. That said, color degrades over time. Color additive processes, especially on film and photos, can also degrade over time because gelatin is sensitive. Photographic materials are incredibly finicky, to say the least, right? So,
yeah. Well, that's interesting. I mean, is it more authentic? Is it not? I mean, does that even matter? I mean, I don't know. I don't think there's any answers to any of this, but it's just an interesting way to think about it. I mean, because we started talking with the Jackson film, and then we look at like this period picture, and it's just, one would think, I think a knee-jerk reaction would be, this is more authentic, or this is authentic, full stop, if you will. Because, I mean, it's of the time. I mean, the colors do seem to line up with my very limited knowledge of French army uniforms. I mean, seen other things, it looks right. I mean, for the time, especially. I mean, even the background looks kind of interesting, like with what's going on. I mean, there's a poster on the wall back there. It might be hard to kind of see, but I just think it's these little details like that I think are kind of cool. Like, I mean, again, that could just be me being like, cool history, I love it. But I mean, like, these things can be problematic as much as they are interesting. Like, we don't know, does it, like, he's guessing, he maybe forgot, I don't know. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's a really interesting way of kind of going about thinking about these questions in terms of your own work. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say that this color is more accurate because we're not guessing. Because we know that, like, sensory experience, Castle now was there. He was the one who took the photo. So that way he has an idea of what those colors should look like versus like us in the 21st century. We're guessing what things look like based off of like extant things that have remained, such as like uniforms, posters that are in collections, weather reports. Like, we're guessing, whereas this might be a little more accurate because I don't know if Castle now developed his own photos. There's a lot of his materials are in French, and I'm fairly confident in French language, but it's hard to access some of that stuff right now because pandemic life.
Yep, that's hitting us all. But I mean, there's only so much you can do in terms of access. But I mean, like, I think it just more adds more questions and kind of creates more avenues for you to look at for your work. I mean, not knowing for sure, I mean, what's the process of the photographer? What are they trying to do? But anyway, sorry, you mentioned something about colors degrading. We were just briefly chatting about this before. Is you've worked with actual artifacts with color degradation. I wonder if you could just kind of talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, so I've worked at the military museums in Calgary. If you don't know what that is, if you're in Calgary, like when things are open again, please check them out. They're super awesome. The people that run the museum are like, they're good. But it's a collection of museums. PPCLI, the Strathcona's, King's Own Calgary Regiment, the Calgary Highlanders. There's an Air Force Museum, a Navy Museum, and the Southern Alberta Army Museum, or the Army Museum of Alberta, all in one building. And
cool.
I worked at the time when I was working with the objects in question, which are the Victor Taboyka uniform collection, and he has the most extensive collection of Canadian uniforms from the First World War. He has a uniform for every single unit, as well as objects that correspond. Like, it's a massive collection. Like, he bought a second house to house the entire collection. Like,
That's awesome.
This is the level of nerdery we're talking about.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So he loaned the artifacts to the military museums. We put them on display, and they were on display for a long time. When I worked there in 2018, something like that, 2019.
Pre-pandemic.
One of the two. They were transitioning those uniforms from the military museums to the Royal Military Institute in Toronto.
Right.
And part of that process meant that I had to do all this cataloging and like making sure that everything that we were sending was being received on the other end. And it included photographs, like taking photographs of the uniforms and condition reports. As part of those condition reports, I had to go through every single uniform, every single piece, from the button stick to the like boots to like the interior of the uniform, checking that everything was fine. And along that process, I realized that the colors on those uniforms varied. So First World War uniforms, the inside facing where the buttons are together, in like fashion terms, that's the facing. They're two different colors because the inside of the uniform, because it's not been exposed to light, has not degraded as much as the outside. But because they're facings together, they're two pieces of wool, they aren't affecting each other in color. And because they're dark, the color just hasn't saturated out of them. So the facings on the insides were a much darker tone of green than the outsides were.
Right.
And when it comes to the First World War photos, those colorized by Canadian Color, he's working off of the Victor J. Teboyka book collection.
Okay.
Because he's also come out with a book for reference. So he's working off of the photos in that book to predict color, but it's been 100 years.
Right. Okay.
Color degrades, right?
Yeah.
So
I'm up with you now.
Yeah. So color degrades. So think of it like throwing your black t-shirt into the wash, and over time it turns gray, right? That's the sort of thing that we're talking about, except on a much larger scale. And we're now applying it to photographs and claiming that this is authentic color and accurate color, right? So, yeah.
And I mean, that's obvious. Well, that's, interesting. That's something I don't think gets thought about even by historians. Other than ones who work with museums. It doesn't come up. This whole idea of aging, degradation, all this stuff. It doesn't come across for me, really. I own like a postcard or two that I know I don't want in the sunlight because it'll ruin it. But like, other than that, I don't come across this stuff. But and this kind of makes me think of another question, right? And like you said, there's a book that is published. I assume it's out already.
Yeah, the Teboyka book has been out for a while. It's a few $100s.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's
that's
very niche.
Another problem where you can't tackle. Anyway, but sorry, yeah. So that kind of leads to the next question of, again, like this idea of fading, but also the conditions of warfare. It could be inauthentic because there's 100+ years of fading or what have you, or lack of. But also we don't know what the soldiers on the battlefield look like. There's laundry units, not very many, but they exist. Soldiers aren't getting to them very often. But is that, and again, making it less authentic? Again, I'm not challenging, and you might not even have an answer. It doesn't really matter. But the idea of like, maybe it was authentic. Maybe this guy was wearing faded uniforms. Maybe the guys at Vimy Ridge, their uniforms were completely faded. Who knows?
Like we don't know, right? Like we don't know. I would hope this is not the case, but like we don't know if people were recycling uniforms off of dead bodies.
Yeah,
right. Like that's
I don't know anything.
That's where my morbid brain goes.
Yeah, we're taking a dark turn here on this day in Canadian military history, but
but it's not outside of the realm of possibility, right?
We don't know. Again, who knows? There's accounts of them taking all kinds of stuff from bodies. It happens. The Canadians, this is a huge generalization, but I think it's well documented. The Canadians had some sticky fingers on the battlefields of the First World War. They were doing all kinds of things they shouldn't have been doing. I mean, for their own personal safety. I mean, those stories just make your hair stand up and go, what are they doing? Or what were they thinking? But also they're taking things. And our uniforms, you know, off limits, going to say no based on just my own understanding of it. And who knows, right? Like, I mean, I don't think that it would have been widespread. I hope not. But again, we know there was uniform issues. I mean, those were eventually sorted out, but it took some time. But again, who knows what goes on at the battlefield?
Yeah,
and I mean, like, if you strip a dead body, you're not going to tell anybody.
Yeah, and also, like Passchendaele was just muck, right? Like that's just mud that's getting everywhere.
Yeah.
If I went and rolled around in some mud today, I doubt that I'd be able to get all of the mud out of the clothing, right? Like that's still going to be in the dirt is still going to be in the uniform,
right?
Even in like trace particle form. So, yeah, who knows, right?
Like,
again,
I mean,
it's all guess and check.
Yeah, I mean, there's photos. I mean, I can't think of any Canadian examples, but I've seen photos. I think it was American troops. They were, I think it was maybe during the Ardennes. They were stripped. Their boots were all stripped off. The German troops took them because they were even worse. They had even worse. So, I mean, are these things outside the realm of possibility? Probably not. So, I mean, again, I get that's the overarching theme of today is throw a wrench in here. We don't know. These things are possible. I mean, yeah, maybe they are fated. Maybe that is correct. I don't know. Or it's not. Who knows? I mean, these conditions of war, First World War, I mean, Passchendaele, 100 days. I mean, who knows? They're moving in 100 days. Maybe they were even worse because there's nowhere to sit still and, you know, kind of do that ever. I mean, it's really interesting. I think that's an interesting wrench to throw into our assumptions. I mean, that's one of the things I like to do, and I assume you're the same, is, you know, we're assuming way too much about all these conditions and all these things. And I think colorization is one way to talk about it. It's because we assume nonstop. And sometimes I think it's worth a pause. But again, I could be making that up, but I think you would agree. Yeah, so I think that's just a really cool kind of way of thinking about it. So you sent me some other photos. We can get looking at those. These ones I think were interesting. I mean, the one of, I assume that's a child, is kind of creepy. I mean, I'm getting like a 19th century ghosts in a horror movie kind of vibe. I don't know if that's from the colorization or what's going on there, but I wonder if you know anything about what's going on there. That would be awesome.
So this is a postcard from the Wartime Canada online collection. It's also part of the physical holdings at the Lay and Lois Research Collection at Western, which is basically Vance's 3 extra offices that are used to hold wartime ephemera. And it's a postcard, so we know it's mass produced. And it basically talks about like how when you're combating the war, you're trying to defend your family at home. That's the like really rough translation at the bottom of the postcard.
Yeah.
And so that's why you have the little child. But it's not uncommon in colorization in hand tints that like people look creepy. Right? Like we're coming out of a period where like memento mori and like death photos are very common of children. We're coming out of a period where color gets applied to the photograph because otherwise you look dead. Like your skin tone doesn't look real. So you use color to make you look real and alive. So you apply color to cheeks and clothing and I mean, the little boy's hair is colored.
Yeah. I mean, I was gonna say that's what it looks like it's going on here. I mean, it's posed obviously, but like the kid looks sickly and they threw some flowers in their hands and made them blonde to make them look good. I mean, it's a little unsettling to maybe our modern sensibilities, but I mean, I get the message behind it. I mean, I just looked into this a little bit, but that's common. Like you said, it's common across the war, protecting the home front. You're protecting your home, but particularly in France, anywhere it's literally true, but it's also it was a common theme of French commemoration was children and that kind of thing. So I think it's a really cool connection. But I mean, other than the fact that it's kind of creepy looking, I mean, to our modern sensibilities. But again, maybe that's an issue too. Like we're thinking it's kind of creepy instead of kind of getting the message. again, I don't know. I'm just kind of making that up. But maybe you could talk about the next one too, because it looks like it's Canadian by the looks of it.
So both of these were sent to Canada. Like they were sent from France by Canadians to their loved ones, right? So, or vice versa, to one somewhere in France was sent the other way.
Right.
Sorry, just needed to sneeze. It was coming.
Okay.
So yeah, so again, these postcards are fairly common. They're mass produced. The integration of the photograph in this one is actually really interesting because it follows up on a trend that happens in photography more generally, which is, Carla Jean talks about this. It's the composite photo.
Right.
So it's the photograph of the hands is one, and then the flowers is another, and then you integrate the shield and the flags as another part to create one singular image.
Right.
And I think in this postcard, it's actually, that creation of the composite is actually pieces of plastic that are actually laid on top of each other to create the depth in the image.
Wow. Okay. I've never heard of that before. Yeah. So that's super fascinating. I mean, it makes sense. Again, we talked about that. You say these things, you're like, oh, of course. But like, I mean, the time period, I mean, that's to me, that's amazing that they were able to kind of do this and then mass produce it. And it seemed normal.
Yeah. And I mean, this is like, this would be an expense, right? Like this is an expensive postcard. But again, not uncommon. Labor industries were set up for this sort of production, especially in the later part of the war where like the war went on for 4 years, right? So of course industries are being set up, especially industries geared towards women who are missing a loved one and who need to sort of create that connection, right? Yeah, and that's actually also not divorced from the marketing of cameras. So Kodak, at least in the American context during the First World War, used their campaigns to sell photos. Actually were like, well, you need this camera because these photographs, as you send them overseas, are going to connect the absent father to the home, and vice versa. He will send you photos, you can send him photos. So he's no longer actually absent. He's physically absent, but not spiritually, mentally, or otherwise.
Right.
Which I think carries on from that really creepy child photo, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's like a direct connection of the home front family, which is a huge part of the war. I mean, we know that, and it's all over kinds of all the letters and everything. But again, the idea of these photos and the cost to me is always amazing. I mean, you would expect no photos, but this is a bit of a digression, but the individuals who would get photos done, like it's probably the only time, because I think Carla's probably the only time that individual may have been photographed in their entire life. I mean, and maybe they're in a war photo later, but it's a lot of legwork to do. But I mean, for the first time, them, getting to pay for a photo and being able to send that across, I think is amazing in terms of what the technology existed. And I don't know, maybe it seemed like it was getting cheaper. Like, am I off base?
Oh yeah, no, it was absolutely getting cheaper. So I make the comparison that, I think this is in my master's thesis, that like, while $1.10 a week for a private is like a lot of money to them, but that's the same cost as buying a print from a photo exhibit in 1917, right? Like those costs are extortionate if you're a private, but if you're upper ranks, I think captains, second lieutenants up are their rates of pay are, I think a second lieutenant is around $8. I could be misspeaking.
I think that's about right. Yeah.
Right. So their rates of pay are higher. So therefore they have better access to money to be able to buy these things at the like 25 cents that they're being sold for. Right.
Right.
And the Brownie camera is like $5. Right. And that's cheap.
Right.
a vest pocket is more expensive, but it's also smaller, more compact, and is built to be like an upgraded camera, whereas the Brownie gets marketed as, well, first off, it gets marketed off as a toy, but then it gets promoted to women to capture their lifetime experiences because men are using the more sophisticated cameras. So this is like the Brownie is the women's entry point, right?
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be surprised that that's the case. I mean, yeah, it's another one of those things. You're like, yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense. I mean, technology is often like introduced as toys. I mean, and then there's always a gendered element to marketing. And
but yeah, cameras are becoming cheaper and more affordable at this time, right? Because the industry picks up.
Yeah, well, I mean, 4 years of war across an entire ocean. I mean, it's not the first time in Canadian history, but it's the first time it's almost en masse. I mean, South Africa, yeah, there's not that many, but it's First World War. It's a mass. Like there's no getting around it. There's so many people are crossing the ocean, and again, maybe women too. Families followed. So again, it's just this kind of change. I guess maybe I'm just thinking about this in terms of more of the question. I think, and I learned this one from Jonathan Vance, is the idea of the First World War. You know, is it the first modern war? Is it a reflection? I'm sure you've come across this yourself, but like, is it the first modern war? Is it a reflection of the time before? And I guess that question just kind of gets stuck in my head when it comes to photography, right? Like, is this like a dawn of a new era? Is this something the same? I mean, maybe that's something you could talk about. Then we can move into the private photos after that, because I think that might be a good bridge.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, yes, the First World War is the first modern war, but it's not the first war to be on camera. It's not the first war to be captured on film. Crimea, Roger Fenton.
Yes.
He takes photographs. The Civil War, there are photographs in that, right?
Thousands of photos, yeah.
But the First World War is the first time that an ordinary average soldier has access to a camera.
Right.
Because they're cheap enough. They're mass produced, they're cheap enough. You can, like, the industry supports this. There's an increased leisure time that then gets associated with hobbies like photography, right?
Right.
And like the expansion of the middle class due to industrialization, right? So there's all of these factors that kind of create this really cool and interesting moment in time that lets cameras work to capture war in a way where modernity becomes associated with the advancement of technology.
Right. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense to me. I mean, if you think about it real quick, like from Crimea to Brady's photos at Gettysburg, I mean, I think those are the most famous ones of that war. And on through, and then you have South Africa. I mean, there's film in South Africa. I mean, there's just little bits and pieces, but it exists, and it's striking to see. But you don't have this perspective. You don't have the soldier perspective, which I think is immense. I mean, and also too, and this is, I think, connected. We're talking about letters. The level of literacy is higher amongst the average soldier. I mean, education changes in the late 19th century, early 20th, play a part in that, and I think these things are connected. Yeah. This is, I guess we didn't talk about this one, but it's another colorization. I do want to move on, but I think this is a cool kind of example of the differences you can see.
Yeah, and so this one's actually
the two types.
Yeah, this one's actually digital color. So this is a photograph that the color photo is one that I pulled from the Vivi Foundation's Instagram. And it's like their interpretation of the war versus the original black and white.
And I mean, there's different elements that you see in each, which I think is fascinating. But again, we talked about that. But now this is kind of a cool photo. I mean, I wonder if you kind of, if you don't, no big deal, but if you kind of know the context of this photo, because it looks kind of cool. I mean, it's not what you would expect of a First World War photo. And there's a guy holding a camera in the photo. So I was wondering, like, if you could maybe talk about this a little bit.
So there are 3 cameras in the photo.
Oh, okay, cool.
So there's the soldier on the far right.
This guy?
Yep. The girl beside him.
The box?
Has a little box. And then there's another lady whose back is turned with another box.
This one?
So So there are 3 cameras in that photo, plus the 4th that's actually taking the photo.
Right.
And like, I really like this. This is like the photo that I have on like all of my social media banners, because I just think it's super interesting, and it kind of breaks with what we think of as war, right? Like,
Exactly.
No one's going to be happy and jovial. Like, come on.
Yeah.
But it breaks that assumption, and I don't know much about this. It's unnamed. We don't know who took it. We don't know the context of why they took it. I imagine that it's a picnic of some sort, because it's summertime.
Yeah.
The clothes look lighter.
Yeah, I would assume the same. I mean, it looks like they're having a good time. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it looks like they're a mix. I mean, we got a Navy in the back here. Again, making an assumption based on all I can see, but
yeah,
looks like somewhere in the Navy there, which would make sense, because maybe it could be a family. Army. Yeah, he's definitely Army. I mean, it looks Canadian. It could be cavalry. I don't know. Just again, making assumptions. But yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting too, because something I found really interesting, and I've brought this up I think I brought this up in the photo discussion with Carla that I did a while back. But the Jackson film reminds me of certain things, of this idea of seeing a camera, particularly even a film camera, because it would have, I think, looked like a novelty to the average soldier. I mean, they're all, doom and gloom, not blaming them, coming out of the trenches. They see the camera and they light up like they're kids. Like it's to me, it's funny. I mean, they're just normal people. People don't change all that much over time periods. Like, these people look like it could be taken now. I mean, the way that people are posing, the clothes are obviously different, but like I've seen this expression. I've seen people do this in photos, whether on purpose or not. I mean, that still happens. I mean, it's not always these stoic, you can't smile photos. That's not true. And I mean, and I think this is an area of photographs that is under discussed. I'm sure you have more insights into this, but this kind of concept of what we think the war is like, and that photo of the soldier who's supposedly shell shocked, which we have no idea. We're never going to know. Contrasted with this, like, I've literally had people say every soldier who served in the First World War was shell shocked. And I'm just like, what? Like, what does that even mean? But anyway, like, he's clearly having himself a good time, with the camera and documenting stuff. So I think, you're right. This photo is super fascinating.
Yeah. And I think people take photographs differently than we do now. And I say that because
what do you mean? Yeah. What do you mean by that?
I say that because we carry cameras in our pockets every single day, right?
True.
Like, our phones are cameras. And I mean, I know some people, it's a very conscious decision to take a photograph using their phone versus an actual camera. But like, we carry the technology to take a photo with us every day, all the time. Whereas, like, in the 90s, like early 2000s, it was a big deal to have a camera.
I mean, right? I remember that. I grew up in the 90s. I mean, my parents didn't get a camcorder until I was, I don't know, teenager. Like, we borrowed them for like vacations and stuff. And these things were beasts. I mean, my dad had to carry this old honking thing that had basically a VCR in it all around Disney World. I mean, it was a huge deal. Yeah. Now it's nothing. So, I mean, again, I think you're right. It's this purposefulness and this, but also this, and like, I think from the last photo, it can capture candid moments as well. Like, that is still there. And I mean, things like that could get lost in colorization. Adding it, cropping it in certain ways, I think is a problem. And again, it's just another one of those things of keep in the front of the mind. Do you know about this one here that I pulled up? I quickly read it over. I think it's really interesting.
So
if you want to talk about it a bit.
Again, like, I don't know much about this photo because it's an unknown portrait, but it's a postcard. So on the one side, there's the message, like, please pass this around to the boys. It ain't a very good one. Right? Yeah. Like, that's such a sweet sentiment of like, I know it's not a great photo of me, but like, it's important that I took this photo because he's in his full uniform and it's taken in a photo studio, which means he would have made the conscious decision to, after he got his uniform, to go search out a photo studio to get his portrait taken. And there are multiple ways that you can like interpret this, but like, I think that at some point it crosses your mind that you're going to war and you're going to die. And so you want your family to remember you in a specific way. And I think that part of that specific way of like being remembered is the healthy guy in the postcard that sits on the mantle.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's not the cross. It's not the person with the missing arm or like who has to wear a reconstructive mask because half of his face has been blown off. Right. Yeah. It's the person before the war that they want remembered.
Right.
Yeah. But again, like it also shows the importance of the photo, right? Like people,
right.
In the prairies, photo studios are kind of rare. There's one in Edmonton, Ernest Brown. There's actually a couple. Ernest Brown is the big one in Edmonton, and there's one in Calgary too. But those are the two main hubs in Alberta, right? So you have to go to those main hubs to get access to a bunch of things. But while you're there, well, why don't we stop in and take the photo, right? But I don't know how important that would have been if you're off to sell cattle or to sell grain, right? To take a photograph.
Right. Yeah, I think the context is huge. I mean, like you said, it is, I think, and I mean, we could talk about this forever, but it is literally capturing a moment. They are purposely capturing a moment. They want their family to have that moment because it could be the only thing that they have of them left. And for a lot of families, unfortunately, that was the case. This was it. I mean, this is it that I ever had again. I mean, there's telegrams, but even those, I've seen so many service files, everything's returned undeliverable because they moved or died or who knows. But anyway, so like there's this purposefulness to this kind of capturing in the moment. And then maybe again, because I don't want to hold you too much longer, we can look at, like this one, I mean, is another one, right? Like, like where's that quote come from? Like, is that on the back? Is that from like the album?
Scribbled on the back. This is a poor one. I broke the glass in the camera. And I think in part it's jovial, but I think also in part it's a film camera. We don't know what photograph is being taken until the photograph is taken and developed and we see it in our hands, right? So, I think
that's just really, I mean, you've got it, might as well. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, like all kinds of photos that are not, there's imperfect, they're cracked, overdeveloped, whatever. But it's just interesting. So this one, I assume was sent to somebody. I would assume so. I think that's a fair assumption. If they're putting this little note on there, again, I think this talks to this. We have these assumptions about, this lack of humor and seriousness. And this is like kind of like an oops, I'll send it anyway. What's the harm, So this one I thought was really interesting. And this is kind of like, this is the same one. So this is the Cox album. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more kind of.
So
and if you want me to move forward or back, let me know.
So again, the Cox album is super interesting because it's just like a weird compilation of stuff, right? Like he has the fabric from a German plane that they shot down as part of it, right?
Cool. Is that what that is? Okay.
He describes what it is right on it. I see it there.
It's just misspelled. Yeah, I just spelled plane wrong. I took him literally there for a second. This like cut off a German plane that we captured. Oh.
On August 8th.
On August 8th.
Right? So
1918, I would assume. Making another assumption. So it's Amiens.
I mean, who knows, right?
Yeah.
But then he includes these like personal small photos into it.
Are these the ones you're talking about?
Yeah. And he gives them a little bit of a caption, but that's the extent to which he describes the photographs. But it's really interesting because he chose to include the photos. They're important enough to become part of this broader experience and this broader scrapbook where there's like, he has menus from reunions at the Legion shoved in the front, right? So
yeah, you see that often a lot. The Legion menus, I think they're so interesting because they're usually themed. Like the food is all themed. I thought that was always interesting. But there's that sense of humor coming through again, I think. But yeah, so we don't know too much about these photos then, do we?
No, based on their size, based on
Yeah.
their size, they're private photos. I can't run any of my like normal digital tools, so I created like my own software where I can cross-reference official photos with private photos.
Cool.
And like I tried doing that with these and nothing came up, so I'm assuming they're private because of that, but like I could also be running a code wrong.
Okay. So, well, okay, so you don't have to know, but these photos then, because you're assuming they're private, right? But it says German. Where did he get them?
Again, like this could be part of the whole Canadians liked to loot discussion, right? He could have pulled them off of a German soldier in some way, shape, or form, right?
Right.
Again, there's very little context.
It's an assumption I'm making.
Yeah.
I mean, it says German, as far as I can tell, it says our German views of places after our retirement in 1918. I assume that means the spring offensives of 1918.
Yeah, so
that's
German
really
views normally, yeah. So whenever they say like some like Canadian view, British view, German view, they mean this is that country's perspective of the war. So it's probably the German perspective of where they retired in 1918.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I assume, what says, our retirement. So I assume that means, the spring offensives as they push back. But again, that also leaves the question, how to get them? Probably a little bit of, Again, I think we know the answer.
I don't know when he was demobilized because I haven't looked at his service file in a year, maybe 2.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to, you could do the digging, you could find out what's going on here. Because all that's available now. But it's just really interesting. Again, we're just speculating of what any of this even means. But I just think it's really interesting and how this all kind of connects together, particularly with photos. This is the same album. Oh, this is a different album.
This is a completely different album. This is Lieutenant Murray James Nichols' album. And so he signs up with the Cameron Highlanders, I think. But then he ends up enlisting in the RAF, which is how he gets to Egypt.
Right, which makes perfect sense.
Yeah, but like I didn't know that. So when I came across this at the War Museum, I was like, why is there like nothing was happening in Italy, nothing was happening in Egypt. What's going on?
Well, the only reason I know, like I said, that's a good assumption is because that's Lester Pearson's story, right? He's a foot slogger for a short period of time, or he was straight up in the Royal Flying Corps. I don't know, it doesn't matter because that's where he ends up, right? He ends up in Egypt and gets hurt and then goes on his trajectory in his life. But anyway, so that's the only reason I know that is these weird connections that happen. I mean, we think about this in terms of the Second World War, Canadians are everywhere. This proves that this is true for the first. I mean, this is Egypt. I mean, it's a front against the Ottomans for almost the entire war. So it makes perfect sense when you stop and think about it. But again, these are really cool because there's photos of himself in here. And then too, also, sorry not to cut you off.
But no, it's all good. I mean, this is also
this one here kind of marking what's happening.
And Nickel is really good actually about annotating all of his photographs, which is really rare in scrapbooks.
Rare.
It's more common with officers to have marked up their scrapbooks, whereas like privates, sergeants, colonels, corporals don't. They kind of just throw them all together. And it's actually you're more likely to find officer scrapbooks than you are with like other soldiers.
Right.
And I think that's part of like the collecting process that happens because they're more identifiable. They have quotes, a better history attached to them.
Right. Well, and officers the general standard of living is higher. It's much easier to preserve a photo or even give a scrapbook back to somebody when you have to leave way more than the other ranks.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there's that element too, is just literally, they could be like, oh, here's this one when they're on leave, or send it off, what have you. I mean, it's not surprising that officers are more surviving. I can't even think of the right word, that they survived, the time period better. But yeah, like I think this shows so much that, again, so many assumptions we make with the First World War, particularly Canada's, stuck in a trench for 4 years. This guy's in Egypt next to, in a desert. Not the case here.
Yeah, and I mean, Nursing Sisters albums, at least the two that I've seen so far, are also very similar in that they talk about Egypt. They talk about things that men don't necessarily talk about.
Yep.
And that could be access to space. That's for a whole different reason, right? But yeah.
But yeah, anyway, we'll wrap up shortly, but I just want to finish going through these. So these ones are kind of cool because this is a different album again. This is a field ambulance photo album.
Yeah,
Did
so
you know
this
anything
one.
about the context of this one?
Yeah, so this is Ernest Selby. He was part of 8th Field Ambulance. He actually ends up in Calgary retiring. And his entire military, First World War military collection, uniform, personal items, scrapbook, gets donated to the military museums in Calgary. And that's actually how I came across this, is because
awesome.
we put an exhibit together on field ambulances in the First World War. And this scrapbook is massive. I think it's almost 290 pages big.
Wow.
It's a hefty boy. But it's a mix of these really personal photographs like this one, where you have photos of him and people. And he's just talking about going on a rail car. Right? And I don't know if this is in France. I'm making the assumption based on the other pages that this is in France.
It says coaches used in France, so I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Also based on the rail. It's hard to see. This isn't a quick clear.
Yeah, and then
I can see that it says officers down here though, which I think is interesting. This is this is the nice. Well, yeah. I mean, there's always the separation of officers and other ranks, but I mean, it doesn't look like first class ride, but it's better than the other ranks would have had, unfortunately. But yeah, and then there's this photo here, which I think is incredibly personal because it's focused on one individual. Yeah,
so it's in memory of Private Starkey. I don't know who Starkey is. There are a handful of Starkeys in the personnel records, and I can't narrow down which one it is. Yeah. But it's interesting because all of the albums where he has crosses, he puts in these little floral motifs by hand as sort of personal remembrances. Right? So it's this really interesting mix of personal commemoration and personal remembrance that then gets put on display publicly because it's a scrapbook, and you'd bring out the scrapbook to talk about with your buddies, right?
Yeah. Well, sorry, just a question here, because I know it's pretty well known that in the trenches the cameras were not allowed. I mean, they still brought them in anyway. But was this allowed, particularly from an officer's perspective, to do so? I mean, I don't see how much information can be gained here. I mean, it seems like it's after the war anyway. But say this was taken in 1917. Would this be allowed to be taken?
Yeah, because it's happened, right?
Yeah.
The extent to which it's allowed, I think, is more of the question. There's a guy. There's one case that I know of where he actually ends up being recommended for court-martial because he has a camera.
Oh wow.
So he's caught for the second or third time with a camera, so he gets recommended for court-martial, right? Yeah. But nothing really comes of it other than he gets the crucifix or Christ on a cross punishment, which is where you get tied
field
up to a
punishment number
post
1.
for for a certain amount of time.
They tie you to a post or a wagon wheel. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the extent of his punishment.
Yeah, better than
right?
others. I mean, yeah,
So
it's interesting. Yeah, that it would seem. I don't know. This would seem to me. I don't know. Again, I'm completely guessing, but that
yeah,
Selby was an officer. I'm assuming
yes,
based on
yep,
the car. And there's other ones here, but I think we're running out of time. So
yeah. And
um,
then this is just
this I
that's just an
think the
official
last. Yeah, I think this
that's
is
an
the last
official
one you've sent
photo
me for me. Yeah. Okay.
that
Cool.
gets integrated into the album as like a personal thing.
So that would have been purchased then. Like you could
Yeah,
have bought them.
yeah.
Okay.
So
So he would have
the
decided. Okay. Sorry. Go
yeah,
ahead.
so the photo exhibits that happen in 1917, you can actually buy the prints that are on display.
Right.
And I mean, those prints are also circulated in Canada after the war.
Right.
So, and I'm making the assumption that he's building this album after the war has ended.
Right.
So that way, like access to those photographs gets higher,
Easier.
easier. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, based on what we can see, it looks like because one says literally we're being demobilized, so that would make perfect sense of what's going on here. But yeah, this is really interesting that it's a mix of personal. Like, I mean, to me, this to me, like you said, is the most striking part of all of it. Like he's captioning rail car, you know, standing next to a canal, whatever, other people saying they're a doctor, but takes time to draw this for an individual. I mean, is that something you've seen in other albums? I mean, I know there's not a lot, but is this like stand
This
out
is
to
like a
you?
really weird, rare case where he's done
Yeah.
it.
Okay.
I haven't seen, I see other like drawings in albums, but they're
Right.
quite literally drawings, right? Like someone sketching
Yeah.
on letters and like putting those pages in, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's quick comment. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've never seen this before. I mean, I've seen other, it's mostly Second World War, but they're POWs or they didn't have cameras. It was their only option. Whereas this, it seems after. And it looks like, I don't know, this, again, this is the only one we have here, but it seems like this person must have been pretty important.
Yeah.
To
I mean,
go out of
that's the
your way
assumption.
to do this. I mean,
Yeah. That's
again,
the assumption, right? Like
we're
there's
just
a personal
assuming,
connection.
But, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
there's got to be something going on here. I mean, again, you could probably dig into it if you had the time, but who does? Anyway, so yeah, I think, is there anything else you wanted to touch on before we end up here or we finish up?
No, I think we're good.
Anything burning you want to get out there into the world?
No.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, we've been talking about an hour. You run out of things to say. Anyway, so yeah, so thanks for coming on. It was great to talk about this stuff. I don't know, to me, the conclusion seems to be stop assuming too much. I mean, we did a lot of subjects tonight, but I mean, we're basing that on evidence. It's not based on one photo we saw on Facebook. I mean, we've talked about this. I've talked about this. Other people I've had on here have talked about this. Think a little deeper about it, what's going on, who's sharing it and why. And I think this is important. I mean, you talked about I can go back to it. Maybe that's a good, I can close it. It doesn't matter. I'm not pulling it back up. But anyway, using that Vimy one, the Vimy
Foundation.
the foundation. Yeah, there you go. The word was escaping me at the end there. But yeah, that whole colorization, the difference is what can be seen between black and white originals in terms of authenticity, everything we discussed earlier. So yeah, I think this is really interesting. Yeah, I look forward to see what more work you can do because it looks like you've got lots of questions and not too many answers, as most of us do, starting at the beginning of a PhD. So look forward to seeing what you can come up with. So thanks for coming on. So I'm just going to sign off and I'll say goodbye after we're finished.
Cool.
So thanks everybody for watching. This was really interesting talk of photo colorization, personal photos in war, and kind of the issues that go along with both of those things. So this is towards the end of May. So we're going to be moving into June. Lots coming up, Normandy related and D-Day related. Shocking, I know. We're going to be doing a video of the first Hussars, which I've talked about quite a bit. That'll be coming up. I'm hoping to release it before D-Day. We'll see. That should be a good one. And also I'll be doing some other things, talking with Mike Bechtold on the 5th. We'll talk about the 7th Brigade and their fight in Normandy. And I think I might have some other things in store, but we'll see. I don't want to make any promises I can't keep. So anyway, thanks for watching. Have a good day.